Okay, so thank you for joining us, everybody. My name is Louise Bowe, and I'm from the Tree Council, and I'm the Close the Gap project officer working on our national hedgerow initiative. And it's great that you've joined us this evening for our webinar, Trees and Hedges, How to Plant Them for Healthy, Happy Growth, which is a great beginner's guide session for the start of, or almost the start of National Tree Week. And we're going to be doing a sort of question and answer session. We'll be going through lots of practical tips and advice on how to plant and care for trees and hedgerows. And I've got my colleague, Jon Stokes, joining us, who is our Director of Trees, Science and Research. And Jon has been at the Tree Council for quite a few years now and has planted many, probably thousands, isn't it, Jon, in your time by now? Thousands of trees and hedgerows over many years, which flourish all over the country now. So he does know a thing or two when it comes to planting and managing trees and hedgerows. So I'm going to pass over to Jon to tell us a little bit more about the Tree Council. And there will be plenty of chances to ask questions as we go along later on, folks. So we'll come back to that. Over to you, Jon.
So evening, everybody. And as Louise says, thank you for joining us. So we're just going to do a little bit of introduction on the Tree Council. Is it, Louise, can you see are you just seeing the screen, or have you got the odd questions and answer bit at the top? You're muted.
I can see the main slide at the moment.
That's okay, good.
Yeah.
So, as Louise said, we're from the Tree Council. The Tree Council is the organisation across the UK that brings together a whole different range of other organisations, charities, conservation groups, government departments. And what we do is we work together for the love of trees. And the way that we do that collectively is through a whole series of threads. One of the threads is our practical science and research thread. There's young learning, and we've got a whole group of young tree champions and orchards for schools projects, and over 3,000 schools that we work with around the country. We do that thing about partnership and partnership power and working together with all those different organisations, over 100 different organisations we work with around the UK to deal with trees, and we deliver community action. And lots of community action is done from tree wardens and National Tree Week, which we're in at the moment. And I see a name on the screen, which is Alison Bowden, who's there. I don't know if that's the Alison Bowden we used to work with 20 years ago up in Lancashire, but if it is, Alison, hi, nice to see you. Haven't seen you in ages. If it's not, you won't have a clue what I'm talking about. So we do a whole range of activities, and National Tree Week this week is the starting focal point for the start of the bare root tree planting season. And so we thought we would just go back to some of our basics and just do a little session online about how you plant trees. But as Louise said, our activity spans a whole range of things. We just this last winter, we planted 150,000 trees with community groups and volunteers. We've got that network of tree wardens who are our eyes and ears, working with parish councils and with local authorities across the UK. We've got all those schools joined together to be a force for nature. And if you haven't looked at that, have a look at the Tree Council's Force for Nature stuff. There's some really good stuff there about working with schools. This last winter, we've worked with 46 communities to do really big community tree planting programs of hedgerows and parkland trees and all sorts of stuff. And we give away hundreds of small grants to schools and parishes and community groups. So we're always asked, lots of people ask us, how do you plant a tree? It's the sort of the basic of what we do. So we thought we would explore some of that this evening. But let's start with some of the really important stuff about trees and why do they matter? Why do we do trees? And it's because they provide so many things. They provide habitat connectivity, they provide aesthetics, they define landscapes, they provide recreational opportunities, they cool climates, they change landscapes, they give us our history and culture. And all of those things can be achieved by a tree. So that simple act of planting a tree delivers a whole range of other services. Trouble is, it's not always that simple to plant a tree. And what we're going to do, Louise and I, this evening is we're going to unpack a few of your questions. We're going to try and give you some information to help you And we want your questions. We want you to send us any questions that you've got, and we will try and answer as many of those as we can live. It's not going to be a major presentation with slides. This is more of a conversation. So give us your thoughts, give us your ideas, and use the Q&A button. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen so that you can put all your questions, and we will try and answer as many of them as we can at the end of the session. So over to you, Lou.
Yeah. So let's start with the basics, John. If I want to plant a tree or a hedge, where can I actually do that? Can I plant a tree in my garden? You know, get me started. Where can I actually plant?
So the first thing you've got to do when you're planting a tree is find the most suitable space. And that sounds easy, but what is a suitable space? Well, the first thing you've got to do is get the permission of the landowner, because you can't just plant trees anywhere. You can only plant the trees with the permission of the landowner. If it's your garden, then you're the landowner, so you can plant your tree, unless you live in rented accommodation, in which case you have to check with the landlord. But if you own your garden, your space, you can plant a tree. Anywhere else, you should seek permission. But then when you've got the permission, it's then about what is it you're trying to do? How does the tree fit into the space? So as you can see on this picture, there's a really nice tree of exactly the right size for that space. It adds to the quality of that landscape. It makes a difference in that space. And trees come in a whole range of shapes and sizes, as you can see on the screen. There are weeping ones and open ones and conical ones and pyramidal ones. And what you need to do is pick the right tree for the space, thinking about both what species it is and what shape it is, and making sure that you pick one that's suitable for the size that you've got, because that's the really, really important bit.
John, can I ask something? So if I don't have a garden, I don't live in that kind of property, are there any other places, you know, could I plant, like if I wanted to plant in my local park or any public spaces, in my school grounds? Yeah, can I do that or get involved with that?
You can, providing, as I said, the landowner gives you permission. Okay. So it's about talking to the owner of the land, and sometimes it's easiest to join in an event that somebody else has planned, and then you can plant your tree as part of an event. But you know, talk to the local authority park departments, talk to the local hospital, talk to the school, get their permission to plant, and then you can go on to these other places. Talk to the farmers, see if they want a corner of the field planting up. Mm-hmm. It's amazing, you know, if you're turning up with some free trees, it's amazing how many people will want you to plant them in their space, but you do have to have that permission first.
And that reminds me, we have actually got on our website, if you do want to take part in an event, there are some events going on around the country in National Tree Week, and you can see those on our website and see if there are any in your area. Yeah, so if anyone's interested in getting their hands mucky this week, have a little look and see what you can find.
And I apologise everybody for the slight picture swapping. It's because I've got a demonstration of things in a second without pictures, and the mud from them has already got into my mouse, which is causing it to malfunction. So
real authentic mud on this webinar, John. That's what it's all about. Real
authentic mud. Yeah, never a good thing.
Okay, so John, you've just been talking a bit about sites, and are there any places, any things I really need to be careful with when I'm thinking of my site? You know, anything I should avoid? Yeah. Yes. In terms of the places.
So there are lots of places where you shouldn't plant trees, and we'll come to some more of those in a minute. But the really basic ones is look up. If there are cables over your head, if there are overhead power lines, if there are phone cables, the number of trees we see get planted where people haven't looked up first. So the first thing to do is to look up, and then look around you and see how much space you've got. You know, you don't want to be planting a tree like a huge oak tree right next to your house, because it's just, the two won't enjoy it, the tree won't enjoy it. So make sure you're giving the tree the space. And the thing that you have to remember is not the space that it is when you buy it, but the space that it will need to grow into. And so you need to look up that when you buy trees, they often say how big they will be in 10 years. It's not a really helpful number. What you really need to find out is how big they will be when they get to maturity, to a mature tree. So look up its ultimate mature size and put it in the space that's suitable for that you've got for that.
Okay, that's really helpful, because I was going to just ask about this whole size thing, because it's okay for somebody who's experienced like yourself, and you've got a really good knowledge on different sizes of different trees. But for some of us who are maybe starting out and aren't so familiar, it's that thing about trying to imagine how big a tree is actually going to grow, especially, we might have moved on and moved away or be gone, but it's how big the tree is going to be in the future. And we've got some guidance on our website around that, haven't we, that people can actually use to look up, which gives some information about different tree species and that kind of thing. So there's some useful information on our site, and there's loads of stuff online as well to help you choose, if you're new to the world of trees, that you can have a look and see what size tree or shrub might be ideal for the space that you have available.
If you think about trees in three sort of big classes, there's trees that are sort of under 15 meters tall, under 45 feet, under the sort of height of a house. That's sort of, anything under that is a relatively small tree. Trees that run into the 15 to 20 meter to maybe 25 meter, they're quite big trees. And things that run more than 25 meters are huge trees. So, you need to have enough space to be able to grow your tree. And you don't really want to plant you don't want to plant a hedgerow around your garden that was made up of something like giant redwood, where they could make 300 feet tall. That's the sort of mistake you need to avoid. So they might sell it to you as a fast growing hedge, but it's fast growing because it's going to go really, really tall. So manage, pick the thing that's the right size for the space you've got.
Jon, I'm really glad you mentioned hedgerows. It's almost like we've planned this, because obviously I'm working on a hedgerow initiative, and we've been having loads of conversations this year about promoting hedgerows and how brilliant they are for biodiversity and climate change and loads of things. So if somebody wants to plant a hedgerow rather than a sort of single tree or single trees, what are the ideal species to plant in a hedgerow, whether it's in your garden or maybe in some public space? And what's the difference between sort of planting, if you're planting for a hedgerow versus planting for a single tree, maybe?
So what you're always thinking about when you're planting anything is, why am I doing it? So am I planting it for colour? Am I planting it for biodiversity? Am I planting it for food? Am I planting it for fruit? And all of those questions should determine what you plant and where. So if you're planting a hedge that's designed to stop people breaking in, then you want something that's spiny, prickly. You want something with hawthorns, or you want something with blackthorn, something that's a bit spiny. But if you want something that provides you with fruit, you might plant plum. So you might plant a wild plum hedge. You might want to plant something that gives you leaves all year round, so you might plant a holly hedge. And it's all context dependent. If you're in a countryside, you might want to plant a native species hedge, so you might plant a mixture of blackthorn and hawthorn and hazel, for example, with other things in it. So it really does depend where you are and what you're trying to achieve, and that's true of a single tree or a hedge. Why am I planting it? What does it want to deliver? And what's the right species to do that? And we call that the right tree for the right place. It's a really difficult thing to know until you've done a bit of homework, but think of the characteristics. What is it I'm trying to do with this hedge? What am I trying to create? And then choose the species accordingly.
Jon, you mentioned something there, and it's a phrase that people might see a lot when they're reading up about different species to plant when it comes to hedges and trees, and that's the phrase, you use the phrase native species. So just for, if people are maybe not familiar with that term when it comes to trees and hedges, by that we mean, so correct me if my definition, but I think we mean trees and shrubs that have been living in our climate and our environment for many years, over many years, and they're designed and they've evolved to survive really well in our ecosystem in the British Isles where we are at the moment, rather than maybe more exotic species that grow in other parts of the world. Is that so they're sort of suited better to this area and our wildlife? Is that a sort of a fair description of what we mean by native when it comes to tree species?
Yeah, very fair description, Louise. what happened was there had to be a reference point to, so the point was used when the sea levels rose and England got cut off from France. And at that point, anything that was here when the sea cut us off was classed as native, and anything that's been brought in since was considered a non-native. And that's about 5,000 years ago. So anything that's been here about 5,000 years or so is considered to be a native species. And that gets complicated. You know, some things like beech, people aren't sure when it arrived, and sweet chestnut arrived 2,000 years ago when the Romans arrived. And so technically it's not a native species, but it's been here so long that everybody thinks of it as a native species. And in many ways it doesn't matter. It goes back to that thing about the right tree for the right reasons. So you wouldn't necessarily plant up an ancient woodland full of, you know, native species. You wouldn't necessarily go in and plant a whole range of non-natives in there. But in a park in the center of town or in a street, you can use all sorts of things. Your palette's broader and wider, and you've got a lot more choice. So it depends where you are as to what you want to plant. Yeah.
The amazing thing is there's so many to choose from, aren't there? So yeah, whatever you're looking for, whatever your site, there's such variety of trees. They're so amazing.
Britain has a climate which is probably one of the best suited to growing trees anywhere on the planet. So there are so many trees from across the world that could grow in this country. You know, literally thousands of them that could grow here, and it's about picking the right one, and what's available and what you can buy, and a whole range of other things.
Okay, fab. So, John, if I've decided I definitely want to plant a tree, or I want to plant a hedgerow, a hedge, and I've worked out where I'm going to plant it, and I've got permission if it's not somewhere I've got control over, and I've worked all that out, and it's time to actually go out and get the tree or the hedgerow trees, where do I actually buy them from? How do I acquire them? Okay,
before we do that, Louise, there's this different slide that we've got here. Just while I think of it.
Yeah.
So this one shows some of the places where you might plant some trees, and some of the places where you wouldn't plant some trees. So you might plant trees in orchards or in parks. So this is from Cornwall Wildlife Trust, who did this nice thing on Right Tree, Right Place. And you might be wanting to plant a parkland, you might want to be planting a hedge, you might want to be planting woodland, you might want to be planting some urban street trees. So there are lots of places that you can plant trees, but there are also places that you wouldn't want to plant them. So you wouldn't necessarily want to plant up an old grassland with lots of flowers in it. So there are definitely places where trees are not the best thing to do. There are places where other habitats, other environments are better. And those you don't plant, but there are still lots of opportunities for places that you can. So I'll stop sharing this. Okay. I'll stop sharing this, and then we can. I'll stop sharing that. That's and then you can ask me that.
Yeah, tell me. Yeah, I want to know. So I'm keen. I'm eager. I've got a few pounds in my pocket. Where do I actually go and buy my trees or my hedgerow trees from?
So there are a whole range of places that you can buy. There are places like tree nurseries, specialist tree nurseries whose job it is to grow trees. There are garden centres, and you can buy trees in garden centres. You can buy trees these days in supermarkets, and you can buy trees on the internet. So there are a whole range of places that you can buy. The thing you have to think about is not where you're buying it from, but what are you buying? And the thing that you need to think about is that we're trying nationally to reduce the risk of pests and diseases. And pests and diseases often travel with soil. So what you want to do is not be moving soil too far around to ensure that you're not spreading diseases and pests and diseases unnecessarily. And therefore, as a general rule of thumb, it's best to buy from as close as you can to where you are. You know, buy British, buy something that comes from a local nursery or a local garden centre that's been grown in the conditions that you find it. There are other ways of doing it, and you can buy on the internet, you can buy in all sorts of other places, but the key question is, where has it come from? And ideally, we don't like to bring too many trees into the country. So do check the source of the origin of the trees and try to make sure that they're coming in, they're coming from as local as you can get it. Have we got problems with the sound?
Yes, I was just going to say that, John. We've had a few people saying they're having problems hearing very well through Eventbrite. If you are able to, you can also log in directly through Zoom, which some people have said is better. Apologies, we're not quite sure why that technical issue is happening if you are coming through Eventbrite. So really sorry about that. But if you are able to dip out and come in again through Zoom, that seems to improve the audio quality.
Somebody in the chat said, why not recommend Woodland Trust or other environmental charities that are buying trees? Yes, there's no reason why you shouldn't do that at all. And there are also local community tree nurseries, as somebody said. There's a whole movement that's developing now of local people growing their trees locally. And you know, the closer you can get to where you come from, the better. So absolutely, local environmental charities, local tree nurseries, really good places to see if you can get local trees.
Yeah. John, a phrase that comes up quite often around purchasing and acquiring trees is the term biosecurity. And obviously we've had lots of stuff in the media about different tree diseases in recent years. So can you just explain, you know, to somebody who's maybe a beginner to this whole tree thing, what we mean by biosecurity and how you can look out for that when you're making your purchases? So
biosecurity is that element of making sure that you're not transferring pests and diseases around the country unnecessarily. There are all sorts of developments going on in that space at the moment. There are nurseries that are, there's a sort of an assurance scheme that's being developed so that we can make sure that the nurseries are growing in a biosecure way. That's not quite ready yet nationally. It's certainly got up and started and it's certainly operating, but there are not yet that many nurseries that have signed up to it. But there's that element of that's coming, and what we've got to do is make sure that we don't make bad mistakes in the short term. Yeah. So it's about thinking about where you're getting them from, and it's about looking at the trees when they arrive and making sure that they don't look ill or sick.
So what kind of things, John? Tell me what am I looking out for with that?
Well, ill or sick is a really difficult one to articulate, except by reference to what it's not. So here's one that I grew earlier. And obviously what you're looking for, and ideally whenever you grow something, this one's in a pot. So ideally what you do is you lift it out to have a look at it to see what's going on in the pot. And this is a nice healthy, you can see the soil's really dark. There are not too many roots spiraling around the outside of the soil. If it had problems, there might be all sorts of white fungal masses around the outside of this, and if that's the case, don't touch it. But it's also about whether the trees are looking healthy, whether they're in good form, good shape. It is quite difficult to do, which is why we're trying to nationally make sure that there is a scheme in place that does all that thought for you. But what you're aspiring to do is to look for a healthy tree by just good observation, really. Just check it.
Yeah, okay, that sounds helpful. Okay, so when it comes to when is a good time of year to plant my trees?
So you can technically plant a tree at any time of the year, depending upon what you've where it's come from, whether it's a bare root tree, whether it's a tree that's in a pot. These things are going to affect when you can plant it. So National Tree Week this week is the right time of year for planting, or the beginning of the planting of bare rooted trees that have been lifted from the nursery at this moment. And those bare root trees you want to plant when the tree is dormant. So I have a little whip here. So this is the sort of thing we talk about when we're talking about a really young tree. This is a whip that was lifted from the ground this afternoon. And we're called whips because there's no branches on them. It's got a nice little root structure. And these sorts of bare root trees are being lifted now. And that's why we plant we plant at this time of year in winter, because in winter, those little trees, once they become dormant, once they've effectively gone to sleep for the winter, you can move them, and when they wake up next spring, they often haven't noticed the move. You know, they're put into a new environment and they just carry on growing. The trees in pots you can plant at any time of year, but it's still better to plant them when they're dormant, because the shock of being moved is less. So here's one in a pot, a much bigger tree. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. If I can bring it to the camera, whoops, without destroying the
Don't
place.
wreck your office, John.
I know, it's a very big tree. This one's in a pot. Again, you can see nice dark soil, nice and healthy. There are a few roots on the edge of this which are starting to spiral. That's because this has got to the point where it needs planting out. So you can plant this anytime. We were planting these over the weekend. And again, it is better to plant them in the winter so they get used to being in their new homes for the winter. But technically you can plant them any time of the year. You just need to ensure that they have enough water, and that they, if they're planted in the middle of summer, you have a really, really good planting regime, a watering regime. But okay, I would, as a general rule of thumb, try to plant them from sort of late November till about the end of February.
Okay, that sounds helpful. Okay, so if I once I've got my trees home and maybe I can't plant them, you know, I've got some bare root trees, I'm planning on planting them over the winter time, but actually they arrive, or I get them home and I can't actually plant them for a couple of weeks, maybe the weather's horrendous or whatever. Are they okay just sitting in the packaging? Do I need to do anything special with them, you know, once I've got them, but I can't plant them? What do I do in that in between time?
Yeah, no, that's actually the time that we probably lose more trees than at any other moment, is when they arrive and just before you plant them, because little trees like this, on a really cold day like today, these roots can dry out in 5, 10, 15 minutes, and once the little tiny root hairs dry out, in the cold sort of winds we've been having, the tree can really suffer. So what you need to do is keep them with their roots covered, right up to about 5 minutes before you plant them, at the very most. Then you take them and put them in the ground as fast as you can. Make sure the roots are covered again. If they're in a pot with soil like this, then it's obviously a different ball game. But once they're bare root, they really shouldn't have their leaves, the roots left out for more than 5 to 10 minutes at the very most. If you're keeping them, as you said, because you're not quite ready to plant, you can keep them in a sack or a bag, a white plastic bag or a black plastic bag or something like that, with a bit of soil at the bottom, and some moisture put in, just so that the roots keep damp. And you can then store them in. How wet should that
be, John? How wet should that actually be? Should it be just a bit damp, so not soaking, just a bit damp? Yeah,
not soaking, okay, just a bit damp. And you can store them like that for perhaps a week. But if you're going to keep them for more than a week, then it is better to dig what we call a healing Entrench. Just dig a small trench in the ground, pop the roots under the ground, cover them up, and leave them there. You can leave them there then for weeks. We have had quite good practice quite good results over the last few years of filling the black plastic bag with this much soil. And covering all the roots up in the black plastic bag and leaving them in the bag again damp for 3 or 4 weeks. So it can be done either healing in or in a bag. You can keep them, but you've got to keep the roots moist. Okay,
that's useful. John, just while we're on, before we talked about species and choice and stuff, and quite a few people are asking about carbon capture. Obviously there's been loads of awareness in the media now. More and more of us are realizing the importance of climate change and the role that planting trees and hedgerows can play in helping that. And are there any species that are particularly good for absorbing carbon more than others, or does it make much difference? Is there anything that people need to think about if carbon is their motivation for planting, or does it not make much difference?
So carbon, if my carbon is then That's a complicated. I'm sorry, the reason I'm smiling.
I've asked you a really hard question, haven't I?
That was a really hard question, but I was actually smiling because I saw somebody said they liked my bonsai, and somebody else said, not sure about bonsai, it's cruel to trees.
That's a whole other webinar. That's a whole other
That's
webinar.
a whole other webinar. That little yew tree in there has been in there for the best part of 20 years, and is quite fine. So I wouldn't say cruelty to trees, but it is definitely something that you either like or you hate. She's thriving, but because it is a she, she's thriving.
Yeah, carbon. Carbon. Back to the question. Back to the question.
Planting trees for carbon is about to maximise the carbon uptake. You need to plant something that grows quickly because it's storing that carbon within its structure.
Okay, yeah.
And what that's usually about is about something like a conifer that grows really quickly, and then it's locking up lots of carbon as it grows. If you're planting an oak tree, it'll take a lot of carbon, but it'll take it over a longer time period. So it depends whether you're trying to lock up carbon quickly or whether you're trying to lock up carbon for the long term. And that's a discussion, a debate that people need to understand and people need to think about. It's complicated.
Yeah. And what about, so if you're trying to marry, if you're trying to benefit the climate and carbon side and also biodiversity, because I know a lot of people, there's lots of guidance around some of the conifer species not being so great for biodiversity side of things. So it's a bit of a juggling act, isn't it, in terms of trying to marry these things together?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's lots and lots of work going on in that space. Obviously, the government is currently looking at planting large areas of trees, and the balance then we've got to strike is between trees that are being planted for carbon, which we need to do, but also maximising the biodiversity value out of those trees that are being planted. So there's a huge amount of work going on in that space at the moment. Okay. And we will hopefully get it right, but people will know whether we've got it right in 20, 30, 40 years time.
John, if somebody wants to plant and they're particularly thinking of climate change and carbon, but they, for whatever reason, they don't want to plant a conifer, say if it was in some space in their back garden or whatever, are there any of the non-conifer species that are particularly suitable, or is it they, in terms of fast growing, that is suitable for smaller spaces? Or
well, you can't.
Is that a can of worms to ask that question?
That's a whole different can of worms, and there's a sort of oxymoron there. You can't necessarily have something that's growing fast for a small space, because you could plant a eucalyptus, for example, which is a really fast growing tree, but I wouldn't want one in my small garden. So it's about it comes to what you're trying to achieve.
Do a bit of homework, I think, is the general gist of a lot of these things.
Do a bit of homework.
Yeah, and there's loads of guidance.
There's loads of guidance. Somebody said on the chat, more carbon is often stored underneath the trees, particularly in hedgerows. Very
much, and
is actually is often above ground. It's that longevity of a habitat that the soil drops. The leaves drop. It improves the soil. It builds up over time. So it's exciting but complicated. And we are working on that nationally.
So back to the practical tips and how to do it. We've talked about time of year. We've talked about looking after if we're not planting it for a couple of weeks. It's National Tree Week. What if we actually want to get out there this week and get some actual trees in the ground? How do I do the actual physical planting bit? Take it from the top.
Okay. Take it from the top. Well, so we've assumed that we've got our tree and we've done our biosecurity checks and chosen the right species, and we know the place that we're going to do it. And the first thing you've got to do is dig a hole, because you've got to dig a hole. You've got to put it in the ground. Okay. And digging the hole is not as easy as it sounds. Actually, what you've got to do is dig a hole that's the correct size for the roots. So whatever root area you've got, you need to dig a hole that's suitable for it, and some. So if we take again this little tiny tree here, the hole that you need for this root is not big. It's sort of, I can't I can't do this, Lou, with, you know, it's about that size. I can't hang it in my teeth, but it's sort of about this big. And you probably don't even need to dig a proper hole for something with a root like this. What we do is we dig a trench, a slot. So you just put the spade in the ground, literally wiggle it backwards and forwards, gently slide the roots of the tree into the ground, and then cover it up. The key is to what depth do you plant it? And I don't know if you can see everybody, but on here there are roots. If I get this the right angle, there are roots. So this point here is called the root collar. It's where the roots start to appear where it was dug into the ground. So what you have to do is find the root collar, where the roots start to branch. And it's always obvious because there's a slight change in color, or you can see the roots, and you have to plant to that point. And what we've got here is a little video that we did earlier, which I'm going to try and show, which should show this. So let's see if this works.
John, while you're doing that, John, I'll just mention that we've got on our website a really lovely new practical guide to planting trees and hedgerows, which is on the website, and we'll share it in the chat as well. That is just a nice, clear how-to guide, and a lot of these things John is talking about are all there, so you can have a look at that at your leisure later on.
So can you see the video? Yes. Not that it's running yet.
It's okay. I can see the start, yeah.
So come on, play. So so what I was talking about here is that you've got your hole, and we've got to get that root collar level with the surface. And you can see my hand is indicating the surface point that you're aiming at. So once you've done that, which is there, you then got to get your soil and put it back into the hole, which sounds obvious, but isn't always, because it never quite fits back in. And then, before we go on to the next bit, before you finish, you've got to press the soil down around the tree. Now again, if you can see me, what I always do when I plant a tree is once it's in the ground, you give it a little tug. And that little tug just makes sure that there are air spaces around the roots, if there are any, are moved. And then you do a final healing in, as we call it, pushing down the soil. You're not trying to crush it. You're not trying to make it into concrete. You just push it down gently, but push it down around the roots, pull it up a bit, and then push it down a second time. That closes up the air pockets, make sure that the soil and the roots are in contact. And then once you've planted that, as is got on the screen at the moment, what you then do is you then put some mulch around the tree. And this is the really important bit, particularly with little trees, because what you're trying to do is to stop the weeds from developing in adjacency to the tree. The thing that kills more trees than anything else is a lack of water, and that lack of water is usually caused by competition with weeds and grass. So the way that you avoid weeds and grass is by putting lots of mulch over it. Mulch can be a whole variety of things, you know, composted materials or bark chips or a whole range of other things that you put around the base of the tree, but that really matters. It suppresses the weeds, and it's necessary. And a weed is a plant in the wrong place. Well, in this case, what we're trying to do is avoid those weeds, those plants in the wrong place, from competing with the roots of your newly planted tree. And they will do it really well, particularly grass, which does it really, really well. So by covering the tree with some sort of compost or mulch, you reduce that weed. In the first few years, that really helps, because what that does is it stops the weeds from growing. And then your other threat that your tree may face is some sort of pressure from a grazing animal.
John, can I just stop you before,
there are
John?
A range, yeah.
Before you go on to the next bit, just while we were talking about soil and the actual getting it in the ground bit, a few things to just ask that folks are asking. The first thing is, does it matter about the shape of the hole? Does it matter if it's square, round? Is that relevant? Does it make a big difference? And also about soil types. We haven't really mentioned anything about different types of soil and where we bear that in mind when we're doing the planting.
So there's a lot of discussion about holes, whether you plant a round hole or a square hole. One line of thought goes that if you dig a round hole, the tree roots will go into the hole, they will get to the edges of the hole, they will find it slightly different, and like in a pot, it will spiral within the hole that you've dug. And so there's one school of thought that says you should plant in square holes to avoid that spiraling. There's another, because a square hole, when the roots get to the corner, they then just break through into the soil around. I have not seen a huge amount of data that proves that that's really efficient, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just means I haven't seen it. I've always planted in round holes, so I've never worried about it, particularly if you think about it, because the hole that you've created is probably only one spade. Now, most things that you're planting are only going to be, the hole's only going to be that deep. So a tree's roots will go down deeper than that quite rapidly and sideways beyond that quite rapidly. So within a year or two, they will have broken out of the pot shape that you may have created. And therefore, it probably doesn't matter all that much. But soil does, and it's the thing that we don't do enough thinking about, the quality of the soil underneath. It really matters to two things. What sort of soil is it? Is it an acid soil? Is it an alkaline soil? Acid soils are mostly heathlandy sorts of things.
And how would we know that, John? Yeah, if it's our garden, how would we know what type we've got if we're not sure?
You can get little soil pH testing kits from garden centres that will tell you the pH of your soil. pH is the acid or alkaline component of it. And it's those two ends of the spectrum. Acid at this end, which likes heathery sort of things, and at this end it's chalky, which is chalk downland, lime based. I mean, you should know from around you when you dig a hole in the ground, if it comes up with lots of stones and gravels, it's probably somewhat acid. If you hit chalk, it's limestone. Most garden soils are generally sort of fairly average neutral soils in the middle. But it will depend on where you are in the country. So do check the quality, the pH of your soil, but also the quality. And it's always worth adding a bit of, if the ground is really horrible, it's always worth adding a bit of nutrients, some nice soil, a bit of compost into the bottom of the hole to give that tree just a bit of a head start in those first few years.
Okay, that's brilliant, grand. So you were just about to, before I butted in, you were about to tell us about protecting, or whether you need to protect from animals. Do you need to use guards, shelters, pros and cons of using those, and what kind you can use and how you use them?
So, subject of a great deal of debate. We're just having some research commissioned on it, which will be available sort of after Christmas, which goes into this in some details, and I'm sure we'll have that on our website after Christmas. But what you have to ask yourself is, why am I putting them on? So what is the threat to my tree? Do I have deer populations? Do I have big rabbit populations? Do I have, what sort of predator, what sort of browsers might I have on my trees? And pick your guard accordingly. Over 30 years of doing this, I've seen so many projects that have used tubes when there is no reason to do it. So don't waste money on something that isn't necessary. But if you have a problem, if you have a deer population, if you have a rabbit population, then you need something that will keep them off for the first year or two to give the trees the chance to establish. There is a serious move, as you can see on the screen, towards the development of of non-plastic guards, whether they be cardboard tubes or tubes that are made out of different materials that are now more compostable.
Yeah, there's more on the market now. There's lots of choices.
There's many more on the market, and look, it is sensible to ask yourself the question: do I you know, am I comfortable with leaving plastic in the environment? Do I want to use tree tubes and leave plastic out there? And so many people forget to go back and do the aftercare. They don't recycle them, they don't reuse them. So we need to think about that really carefully. But you also just need to ask yourself the question, do I need one in the first place? And I sometimes wonder, if we planted twice as many trees, would we need the tubes? The data doesn't exist. So there's a little bit of experimentation that you can all do. The trouble is, if you're spending 30 quid on a tree, you really want to make sure that your tree is going to survive the first year. So you're going to want to do something, but it's got to be the right thing for the problem that you're facing.
Jon, what about human damage, not just animals? So say if your tree is, your new tree or your hedgerow is somewhere that maybe is on the edge of a playing field or something like that, where it might be in danger of getting accidentally strimmed, or, you know, caught with a strimmer and that kind of thing, how much of a threat is that kind of thing to newly planted trees? If you know,
huge. I mean, I think strimmers are possibly one of the worst things that we have in the tree planting world. The number of trees in parks and streets that you see that have been ring barked at the bottom because for tidiness, somebody has gone around the base of the tree with a strimmer and just got rid of all the grass. I mean, industrial strimmers can cut through brick. So why you would want to run a strimmer around the base of a living thing and damage it, I really don't know. And we should all be really cautious, if we're a local authority or if we can talk to the grass cutting people, about asking the questions. Why are you strimming? Leave some grass around the bottom of the tree. Let it look untidy, and your trees will survive. We had a meeting with one local authority recently who said that so many of his trees were damaged, he wanted to start all over again just because of strimmers. That's not good. So it's something to think about, not just animal damage. It's not just animal. Humans can be really problematic if they're using industrial machinery.
Jon, what you just said there, sorry to interrupt you, I'm just conscious of time because there's loads of questions and lots of things to fit in. In terms of starting again, somebody's asked a really good question about if you're planting up a boundary hedgerow, that's you've got something there already, but it's gappy. Is it best to try and plant up the gaps and keep what's there already, or actually is it better to start again from scratch?
I would
because that might be something. Plant up the gaps. What can you do in terms of trying to not have it the existing trees or shrubs shading out or out competing the newly planted, especially if they're just little whips? Is that an issue? Is there anything we can do to help that?
It is an issue, and it's a really difficult one, because if you have big trees, particularly if they're sycamores that produce lots of shade, then other trees won't. But there are trees that are shade tolerant, that develop in shade. It's not something that we talk about very much these days, but there are shade tolerant and shade intolerant trees.
Give us some examples of those. Great.
Well, holly, for example, is a tree that loves to grow in shade, which is why you see it as the secondary woodland cover in many woodlands, because it really likes to develop in shade. So if you've got problems, holly can be planted as a shade infill. If you've got a really big tree and you want to deal with it. On the other end of the spectrum, oaks are really shade intolerant. That's why they like to develop out on their own in fields. So think about shade tolerant and shade intolerant. It's not something that a lot of people talk about, but it really matters.
Okay.
If you want to go, there's lots of questions. I've just realised that.
I know. Some of what I'm reading out is some of the questions, that some of the things I'm asking you are in from the questions. We've got loads of things to cover still, but quickly, what about aftercare for our new hedgerow, making sure it actually thrives and survives and is lovely and healthy in years to come? Just some quick top tips on some of that. Things to
First 3 years, make sure you've mulched them. Make sure that they've got water when they need them. They shouldn't need a lot if they've been mulched properly. But if you get a really, really dry April or May, as we did this year, they're worth giving some water to. But it's lots of water irregularly. You don't want to water with a little bit of water every week. That's not good for a tree. Much better to put on an absolute deluge and then leave it for a couple of weeks, because the roots go down. What you don't want to do is to bring the roots up to the surface, because that just creates the problem of more drying out. So more water infrequently is better than lots of water, a little bit of water regularly.
Okay.
And if you get broken branches, we call it formative pruning. Just take a pair of secateurs and prune off broken branches to stop diseases from getting in.
Okay. John, a practical question somebody's asked, but this is one that comes up. What's a good, what if you're planting next to a pavement, pedestrian walkway, what are some trees to maybe avoid for those situations, or some good ones to plant in those situations where it's going to be really close to where people are walking regularly?
That is quite a difficult one, because roots, we know so little about roots generally as a profession, that we don't know very much about where they go and what they do, and they are really almost tree unique sometimes. But there are trees that have roots on the surface. So, for example, beech is a very shallow rooting tree, puts its roots across the surface, and so do birch trees, for example. So if you plant them close to a pavement, they will grow wherever they can, but they will grow often under the surface, and that can cause problems sometimes of lifting pavements and things.
What about sort of things like slipperiness, things that are falling off, slippy leaves or berries and things as well? Is that something we need to consider, those things, don't we, too? I think.
Again, if you're planting next to in a highway situation, you absolutely need to consider some of those longer term impacts of what the tree will do. Leaves is a really tricky one. Slippery leaves happens for many trees, but there are some that are just a bit slippier, like sycamore.
Which are the worst? So sycamores isn't okay. Any others that are good to avoid if you're trying to avoid slippy big?
Well, big leaves. I mean,
just big leaves. If you've got big leaves, yeah, okay. Big leaves.
The bigger they are, the easier they are to crush, and potentially the more slippy they become. So,
okay.
Lime trees, for example, have big leaves. So avoiding those is quite good.
Okay, I'm just whizzing through. There are so many questions. We're not going to be able to answer everything. A lot of these things that folks are asking are covered in the planting guidance that we are sharing, and it's on the website. So if we don't have time to answer your question, you might find an answer in there.
There's a whole thread of stuff in here about mycorrhizae.
Yes, do you want to mention those?
Let's do a little bit about mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae is where a fungus and a tree become symbiotically helpful to each other. They live together in a way that's harmonious for both. And what happens is the fungus wraps itself around the root of the tree, and then the tree gives the fungus sugar, which the fungus doesn't produce, and in trade, the fungus gives the tree water. And there are some results now that show something like some trees might give up to 30% of the sugar they produce to the fungi, but they get 60% of their water. So it's a really good trade. And the science of mycorrhizae in trees is still not truly understood, but adding some form of mycorrhizal supplement to your tree roots is almost certainly beneficial, because if the tree can build that relationship and get the fungi to provide it with some water, then that will help hugely. So, but we're still not, the science is still developing, but it's definitely something that are advantageous to have. Okay.
Just trying to squeeze in a few more quick practical ones, John, before we finish. Do you mulch right up to the stem of the tree? So a bit specific about how close you go to the stem when you're mulching. And also, if you're planting in a lawn, in a garden or in an area, do you need to take up the turf first, or can you plant into the grassy area? A couple of practical ones there.
So the mulch question is, it is better to leave a bit of a dip around the tree. You don't want the mulch really packed up deep. You want a good deep layer of mulch, but you don't want that up the stem of the tree, because that can just let the base of the tree rot. So once you've put your mulch on, it is better to create a little dip around it, just so that the water doesn't build up on the tree as it's growing in the ground. And in answer to the question about planting in a garden, whether you cut what you don't want to do is leave the grass there. So you can plant straight into the grass, but dig off the surface turf, take it away, and then the bit of surface turf that you've taken away, you'll need to add a bit more new soil. It's the grass that you don't want, really. So put some nice decorative bark around it, so that make a circle or a square around your tree so that you can't see that you've got a hole in your grass. And then your tree will have a much greater chance of surviving.
Okay, fab, thank you. Watering, do you need to water in winter? Is it, someone's added, is it worth adding fish blood and bone or anything to it, or do we, what, is it just water?
In winter the ground is saturated or not, depending upon the winter, but the tree's asleep, so it doesn't help. It doesn't help. You could add you could add gallons and gallons of water in December. It won't make a difference to the tree because it's just sitting there quietly asleep for the winter. So don't bother wasting your time watering in the winter. But once spring comes, you need to, if it's a really dry spring like it was this year, you might need to think about it. And there's some really interesting research from Denmark that showed if you add just a tablespoonful of fertilizer to those first waterings in the spring, it makes a huge difference to the tree in ways that we don't understand yet. Okay. So even a tablespoonful of sugar seems to do something. So in that very first watering, where the trees are coming out of winter, if you give them a bit of extra nutrients, a bit of extra kick, it's disproportionate to the amount of effort you put in. And there are researchers that suggest if you really want to maximize growth, just spend a few pounds on any sort of fertilizer, even things that, for tomatoes, just add it to those first waterings of the year, and that will make a huge difference, but we don't know why.
Okay, fab. That's brilliant. Well, gosh, that's so many. We've got loads of questions. We can't fit them all in. So sorry if we haven't managed to squeeze your question in. That was great, John. Thank you. If you've been bombarded you there, you've done very well. What we will do is we've shared the tree planting guidance. We've also got some guidance on tree guards and shelters. There's some other guidance, various things for conservation volunteers, and loads of other useful things that are being put in the chat. If you did have problems with the sound at the beginning, we have recorded this session and we can share that as well. So if you did miss the start and you want to play over that and listen again, that will be there, and we'll share the link with everybody for the recording if you want to look over it again. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great thing to have on our first on Monday night, start of National Tree Week, and good luck everybody. Get out there, get planting beautiful new trees, beautiful new hedges, for climate, for biodiversity, for us as people. They're great for us. They look beautiful. They make us feel better. So yeah, let's get out there and get planting. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John.